At 8 in the evening on December 22nd, 1978, an Argentine fleet sails out of the port of Ushuaia at the southern tip of South America with its lights doused. The ships are running silent. The sailors on deck have been told this is not a drill. Above them, a storm is building over the Drake Passage, the band of ocean between Cape Horn and Antarctica, where three oceans collide, and where the wind, on a calm day, blows at 50 miles an hour. The fleet's destination is three small islands, 20 miles to the south. Cold, barren, almost uninhabited. The kind of place that on any other map of the world would not be worth a sentence. At midnight, Marines from Battalions 3 and 4 will land. By dawn, Argentine aircraft will begin attacks on Chilean airfields. By the second day, 3 Army Corps will cross the Andes through 4 mountain passes. The objective, written in the operation plan, is the Chilean capital, Santiago. The code name is Operativo Soberania, Operation Sovereignty. On the other side of the islands, a Chilean fleet is waiting. The Chilean admiral has been told he can fire if the Argentines move. The Chilean army has mined the mountain passes. Pinochet has prepared for a long war. And then, 6 hours before combat is to begin, 6 hours, the Argentine fleet turns around. The official reason is the storm. The unofficial reason is a telephone call from a man 6 months into his job, sitting in the Vatican 6,000 miles away. This is the story of how 2 countries spent 200 years trying to divide a single piece of land, and how, on a December night in 1978, the war that should have started didn't. This is Patagonia. It begins, as most great geographies do, with a collision. About 40 million years ago, the South American tectonic plate began grinding westward into the Pacific. Where it met the Nazca Plate beneath the ocean, it crumpled, slowly, immensely, and threw up a spine of mountains down the entire western edge of the continent. The Andes. Most people know the Andes from the high deserts of Peru or the volcanoes of Ecuador. But this same mountain chain runs south for nearly 5,000 miles. It does not stop at the tropics. It does not stop at temperate latitudes. It keeps going, past 40 degrees south, past 50 degrees south, until at 56 degrees south, it finally drops into the Drake Passage and disappears beneath the sea. The last 2,000 kilometers of that journey is what the world calls Patagonia. It is roughly the size of Western Europe, 1 million square kilometers, stretching from the Colorado River in northern Argentina down to Cape Horn, bounded by the Pacific to the west, the Atlantic to the east, and Antarctica to the south. And it is empty. By any measure that matters, almost completely empty. Patagonia covers about a quarter of the combined territory of Argentina and Chile. It contains less than 5% of either country's population. There are stretches of road in Argentine Patagonia where you can drive for 300 kilometers without passing a town. The average population density across the region is below 2 people per square kilometer. There are deserts on Earth more densely inhabited. But the emptiness is deceiving. Patagonia is not empty because nothing happens there. It is empty because, for 200 years, 2 governments have been arguing over what to do with it, and have largely failed to do anything at all. The geography is the first clue. Run a finger down the spine of the Andes from north to south, and the mountains divide Patagonia in half almost geometrically. To the west of the divide, Chile. To the east, Argentina. The Chilean side is wet. The prevailing westerly winds come off the Pacific, hit the Andes, and dump their moisture in the form of rain and snow. The result is a coast of fjords and temperate rainforest, more reminiscent of Norway than of South America. Glaciers carve directly into the sea. The forests are evergreen and ancient. Some of the oldest living trees on Earth, alerce, the Patagonian cypress, are found here, some over 3,000 years old. The Argentine side is dry. The same winds, having spent themselves on the western mountains, descend in the lee of the Andes as a parched, ferocious gust. The eastern side is steppe, semi-arid grassland, treeless, scoured by wind that blows nearly continuously. In some places, the wind has bent the trees so persistently in one direction that they grow horizontally, what locals call flag trees. Between these two faces of Patagonia lies one of the largest ice fields on the planet. The southern Patagonian ice field stretches for 350 kilometers along the spine of the Andes. Combined with its smaller northern cousin, it covers an area roughly the size of Wales. It is the third largest mass of ice on Earth, behind only Antarctica and Greenland. From it descend 48 major glaciers, including the one that has become Patagonia's most photographed natural feature, Perito Moreno. Perito Moreno Glacier sits in the southern Argentine Andes, at the western end of Lake Argentino. It is 5 kilometers wide at its terminus. The ice wall facing the lake rises 74 meters above the water, 20 stories tall. What makes Perito Moreno unusual is that, in an age when nearly every glacier on Earth is retreating, Perito Moreno is not. It has remained roughly stable for the last 100 years, advancing into the lake at about 2 meters per day, carving icebergs the size of buildings into the water below. Visitors stand on platforms across the lake and listen. The glacier creaks, it groans, and then, without warning, a sound like a rifle shot, and a tower of blue ice the size of an apartment block topples sideways into the water. The Patagonian glaciers are old. Some of the ice currently breaking off Perito Moreno fell as snow on the Andes more than 400 years ago, before there was a Spanish colony in South America at all. That is the first lesson of Patagonia. The land here keeps a longer time than the people on it. The second lesson is harder. In a cave in the Pinturas River Canyon, in the province of Santa Cruz, on the Argentine side of the divide, the walls are covered in handprints. There are hundreds of them. Stenciled outlines of left hands, small, often the size of a child's, sprayed onto the rock with pigment blown through hollow bone tubes. Around the hands, scenes of hunting. Guanacos being driven into ravines, ola stones flying, rhea birds in mid-stride. The oldest of these paintings are 9,500 years old. The youngest were made around the year 700 of the Common Era. For roughly 10,000 years, longer than any continuous artistic tradition in Europe, people stood in this cave and pressed their hands to the wall. The site is called Cueva de las Manos, the Cave of Hands. The painters were the ancestors of the Tehuelche, the people the Spanish would later call Patagones, on account of an early misunderstanding of the size of their feet. The Tehuelche were nomadic guanaco hunters. They moved in small bands across the steppes, following the herds. They had no permanent settlements. They had no need for them. When archaeologists examined the cave more carefully in the 1960s, they noticed something. The hands were almost all left hands, which meant the painters were holding the spray pipe in their right hand, which meant, across 9,000 years, they were nearly all right-handed, the same proportion as humans today. At Cueva del Milodon, on the Chilean side, near the town of Puerto Natales, another window into the deep past was opened by accident. In 1895, a German rancher named Hermann Eberhard was surveying his new land grant. He walked into a cave on the slopes of Cerro Benitez. Inside, he found a piece of skin, large, leathery, embedded with bone-like nodules. It was attached, he thought, to a creature he could not identify. He sent a sample to the British Museum. The reply came back the following year. The skin belonged to a giant ground sloth, Mylodon darwinii, that had stood 3 meters tall, weighed close to a ton, and gone extinct around 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. In the cool, dry conditions of the cave, the skin had simply waited. 12,000 years, the first non-human source of preserved ancient DNA. The Mylodon was not the only creature found there. Bones of Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, Hippidion, a native South American horse, Macrauchenia, a long-necked, 3-toed ungulate that looked like nothing alive today. All extinct, all gone, within a few thousand years of the arrival of humans on this continent. The first people in Patagonia were hunters of giants. They came down the spine of the Americas at the end of the Pleistocene, and they found a land populated by creatures that by then existed nowhere else. And then those creatures were gone. The cave painters at Cueva de las Manos never knew them. By the time the first hand was pressed to the rock, the giants had already become memory. For nearly 12,000 years, Patagonia belonged to its first peoples. The Tehuelche on the eastern steppes, the Mapuche who came later, expanding southeast across the Andes from what is now central Chile, slowly assimilating the cultures they encountered. The Selknam, also called the Ona, on the main island of Tierra del Fuego, hunting guanaco on land. The Yamana, also called the Yagan, in the channels south of Tierra del Fuego, in canoes made of bark, expert swimmers in waters so cold that European sailors who fell into them died within minutes. Each people had adapted to its piece of the world. The Selknam wore little more than a guanaco skin cloak. Even in sub-zero temperatures, their bodies acclimatized over generations. The Yamana wore even less, on the theory that wet clothing was more dangerous than no clothing at all. They kept fires burning in the bottoms of their canoes, fires that, when Magellan first sailed through the channel in 1520, were so numerous and visible from the sea that he named the place Tierra del Fuego, land of fire. The fires were not signal fires, they were not war, they were just life. The thousands small fires of a people who had learned how to be warm at the bottom of the world. By 1900, those fires were nearly all extinguished. In 1879, the government of Argentina launched what it called the Conquest of the Desert, It was a military campaign led by General Julio Roca with one stated purpose: to clear the southern steppes of indigenous peoples and open them for European settlement. The campaign was brutal and efficient. Tehuelche bands that had moved freely across the pampas for thousands of years were hunted, killed, displaced, or forced into reservations. By 1885, the Argentine state controlled the territory in name. The original peoples did not. On the other side of the Andes, Chile carried out a parallel campaign, the pacification of Araucania, between 1861 and 1883. The word pacification is what the Chilean state used. The Mapuche, who had successfully resisted Spanish conquest for 3 centuries, were finally subdued by industrial-era artillery and railway-supplied armies. They lost most of their land. But the worst happened on Tierra del Fuego. In the 1880s, sheep ranchers, many of them British, Scottish, and Croatian, began to fence the steppes of the great island. The sheep ate the grass that the guanaco needed. The fences blocked the migration routes the Selknam had used for millennia. The Selknam, who had no concept of private livestock, killed and ate sheep when they could no longer find guanaco. The ranchers responded with a bounty: £1 per pair of Selknam ears, higher rates for women, documented in ledgers. Some ranchers paid hunters as full-time employees. The Selknam who survived the bounties were captured and shipped to Europe to be exhibited in human zoos. At the Paris World's Fair of 1889, in Brussels, in Hamburg. Most died there. Those who escaped that fate were taken to Catholic missions where Christianity, smallpox, and tuberculosis finished what the bounties had started. The Selknam had numbered around 4,000 at the start of the colonization period. The last full-blooded Selknam tribesperson died in 1974. The last fluent speaker of the Ona language died around 1990. A people who had lived on the same land for at least 9,000 years. Erased in less than 100. The official history of Argentina and Chile pronounced the indigenous peoples of southern Patagonia extinct in the 1980s. The descendants, Mapuche, Tehuelche, and even some who claim Selknam heritage, challenge that pronouncement today. They are not extinct, but the worlds their ancestors moved through are. On the Argentine pampas, in the deep wind of the steppe, the guanacos still move in the same patterns the Tehuelche painted 10,000 years ago. The guanaco is a member of the camel family, a long-necked, slender-legged grazer the color of dry grass. Adults weigh around 90 kilograms. They live in family bands, led by a single male, with a few females and their young. In summer, they move up into the foothills. In winter, they descend to the lower steppe, where the wind clears the snow off the grass. They are unusually well adapted to the cold. Their blood carries 4 times the red blood cells of human blood, the same adaptation that lets their cousins, the llamas, work in the high Andes. They can survive at 20 below zero. They can drink seawater when fresh water is scarce. When threatened, the dominant male of the band gives a piercing alarm, a sound somewhere between a horse's whinny and a goat's bleat, and the herd moves off as one, in single file, at speeds approaching 40 miles an hour. There are perhaps 1 million guanacos left across Patagonia. Compared to the herds the Tehuelche knew, that is a fraction. Compared to where the species stood 50 years ago, after a century of competition with sheep, it is a recovery. In the deep canyons north of Lake Argentino, where the wind drops below the rim and the air is briefly still, you can sometimes see them in the early morning, drinking from a meltwater stream. And you understand why the painters in the Cave of Hands made them, and not the rest, the subject of their art. In 1865, into the eastern steppes, into a place that had been Tehuelche land for 10,000 years and was now technically Argentine, sailed a tea clipper called the Mimosa. It carried 153 passengers. Most of them were Welsh. Most of them spoke no Spanish. They had come from the coal valleys of South Wales, Aberdare, Mountain Ash, Abercwmboi, having been told by a man named Michael D. Jones that Patagonia was a place where they could speak their language, raise their children in chapel, and be free of English influence forever. Michael D. Jones never went to Patagonia himself. He stayed in Bala in North Wales, raising money. He had spent time in Pennsylvania, observing what happened to Welsh immigrants in the United States. They assimilated within a generation, lost the language, married out, and he had concluded that the only way to preserve Welsh culture was to put a continent between it and the English-speaking world. He looked first at Vancouver Island, then at New Zealand, then at Palestine. He settled on Patagonia for one reason. It was empty. It was, of course, not empty. It was full of Tehuelche. But it was also a region that the Argentine government technically claimed and could barely control, a region also claimed by Chile. And the Argentine Interior Minister, a man named Guillermo Rawson, made the Welsh an offer. 100 square miles of land along the Chubut River, in the heart of the disputed territory. In exchange, the Welsh would settle the land, and Argentina would have a population on the ground to point to when the diplomats next met. The Welsh stepped off the Mimosa on July 28, 1865, on a coast they named Porth Madryn, Welsh for Madryn Harbour, after the home estate of one of the men who had first surveyed the land. Today, the place is called Puerto Madryn. What they found was nothing like Wales. It was midwinter. The land was a cold, dry plain, almost a desert scoured by wind. There was no fresh water at the landing site. There were no trees for shelter. The first families dug homes out of the soft sandstone of the cliffs and waited to die. They were saved by Tehuelche. The Tehuelche bands of the Chubut Valley had no reason to help them. The Welsh were one more wave of Europeans who had arrived from somewhere unimaginable, taking land that had been hunted for thousands of years. But the Welsh were starving, and the Tehuelche were not. And so, by a process that historians have spent 150 years trying to romanticize and 150 years trying to honestly describe, the Tehuelche taught the Welsh how to hunt guanaco. They traded meat for Welsh-baked bread, which the Tehuelche found astonishing. They showed the colonists how to find water in a country that, to a European eye, appeared to have none. The colony survived. The breakthrough came not from the Tehuelche, but from a Welsh woman named Rachel Jenkins. In the second year of the colony, she watched the Chubut River, the river the Welsh had named Camwy, Winding River, burst its banks during a heavy rain. She watched the floodwaters spread out across the dry plain, and she noticed that the soil where the water had reached weeks later grew grass. She proposed digging channels. The men were skeptical. They tried it anyway. By the 1880s, the lower Chubut Valley was a patchwork of irrigated wheat fields, fed by canals dug by hand from the river. The Welsh had created, in one of the driest places in Argentina, a productive agricultural valley. By the end of the 19th century, there were 4,000 Welsh-speaking people living in Patagonia. They built towns with Welsh names: Trelew, Trevelyan, Gaiman, Dollivan. They published a Welsh-language newspaper called Idraffod. They founded the first Welsh-language primary and secondary schools in the world, not in Wales, but in Argentina. The Argentine government, having achieved its purpose, eventually decided that the schools should teach in Spanish. By the early 20th century, Welsh became the language of the home and the chapel, but no longer of school or government. The number of speakers slowly declined. And then, against every expectation, in the 1990s, it began to climb again. Welsh teachers from the British Council began arriving in Chubut. Bilingual schools opened. Today, there are an estimated 5,000 Welsh speakers in Patagonia, many of them young, many of them not of Welsh descent. They learn it as a heritage, an oddity, a connection to a place few of them have ever visited. In Gaiman, in the late afternoon, you can sit in a wooden zinc tea house called Casa de Te, drink Welsh tea, eat bara brith, the speckled fruitcake of North Wales, and listen to the staff switch between Welsh and Spanish at a single table, often within the same sentence. Outside the window, a desert wind moves over a town built by people who arrived on a ship called the Mimosa 160 years ago, looking for a place to keep speaking their own language. There is, it turns out, more than one way for a place to be remote. To understand why two countries spent 2 centuries arguing over Patagonia, you have to understand the geography of the southern tip. And the geography is, in a word, complicated. South of the Strait of Magellan lies the great island the world calls Tierra del Fuego. Tierra del Fuego is split between Argentina and Chile, with the eastern half belonging to Argentina and the western and southern halves belonging to Chile. South of Tierra del Fuego, the land breaks up into hundreds of smaller islands. Channels and fjords run between them in all directions. One of those channels is called the Beagle, after the ship that carried Charles Darwin through it in 1833. The Beagle Channel runs east to west, separating the main island of Tierra del Fuego from the smaller islands south of it. At its eastern end, where the channel opens into the South Atlantic, sit 3 small islands: Picton, Lennox, and Nueva. The islands themselves are nothing. They are cold, barren, sparsely inhabited. Only a few hundred people have ever lived on them at any one time. But they have a property that, in the 20th century, became extremely valuable. If those 3 islands are Chilean, then the maritime border between Chile and Argentina swings out into the South Atlantic, meaning Chile has access to a vast oceanic zone for fishing, for oil exploration, for whatever else may lie beneath the Atlantic seabed. If those 3 islands are Argentine, then the maritime border stays close to the coast, and Argentina alone has access to that ocean. In 1881, after years of friction, Chile and Argentina signed a treaty meant to settle their border once and for all. The treaty drew the line, generally, but with key southern sections deliberately vague. The Beagle Channel was named as the border, but the treaty did not specify whether the channel ran north of those 3 islands or south of them. Did anyone notice in 1881? Probably not. The islands were worthless. The Atlantic seabed had no known resources. There were no economic zones, no offshore oil rigs, no 200-mile maritime claims. By the 1960s, all of those things existed. And by then, 3 small islands at the eastern end of the Beagle Channel had become, quietly, with neither country wishing to escalate, one of the most contested pieces of land in the Western Hemisphere. Above the channel, indifferent to it all, an Andean condor rides the thermals. The Andean condor is the largest flying land bird in the world. Its wingspan reaches 3 meters, more than 10 feet across. Adults weigh up to 15 kilograms. They are scavengers, vultures of the high Andes, and they fly with their wings flat, almost without movement, riding the wind over the mountains for hours at a stretch. Their eyesight is among the sharpest of any bird. They can spot a carcass from several kilometers away. When one finds food on the steppe, others see it descend and follow. Within an hour, a dozen condors will be circling over a single dead guanaco. The Mapuche believed the condor carried the souls of the dead. The Selknam believed it carried the souls of their shamans, the Zon, who could fly. The first Spanish chroniclers, watching one drift overhead, wrote letters home describing a creature so large they assumed it must be a myth. Today, the species is endangered. There are perhaps 6,000 left across the entire Andean range. They live up to 70 years. They mate for life. They lay 1 egg every 2 years. In Patagonia, they nest on cliff faces inaccessible to anything else, including, until recently, biologists. Most of what is known about them has been learned by following individuals tagged with satellite trackers, watching the maps light up as a single bird crosses 300 kilometers in a single afternoon, riding wind that on the ground below is bending trees sideways. The condor knows the geography of Patagonia better than any other living creature. It does not know, or care, where the line on the map runs. It crosses the border 20 times a day. On the Atlantic side of Patagonia, where the steppe finally meets the sea, the coastline is mostly empty. There are sheer cliffs, long beaches of pebbles and broken shell, the occasional ranch road running down to a fishing pier. For hundreds of kilometers, there are no towns at all. But the water itself is one of the richest marine environments on Earth. The Falkland Current, cold water flowing north out of the Antarctic, sweeps along this coast, and where it meets the warmer Brazilian Current further north, the upwelling brings nutrients to the surface. The Atlantic edge of Patagonia is, in places, an ocean in bloom. In the gulfs around Peninsula Valdez, between June and December, the southern right whale comes to give birth. These are the same whales that 19th century whalers killed nearly to extinction. Slow, surface-feeding, easy to catch. In the early 20th century, there may have been only a few hundred left in the South Atlantic. By the 1970s, there were perhaps 2,000. Today, after 50 years of protection, there are between 5,000 and 6,000. They return to Peninsula Valdez each austral winter to calve and nurse, gathering in the protected bays where the water is shallow and the pups can rest. Mothers and calves spend hours at the surface, often within sight of the cliffs. The calves are born around 5 meters long and weigh close to a ton at birth. They double their size in the first months of life. The whales are the slow ones. The fast ones are the orcas. Off the beaches of Punta Norte, on the eastern edge of the peninsula, a small population of orcas has developed a hunting technique observed nowhere else in the world. The beaches here shelve gradually. The sea lions and elephant seals haul out on the sand to molt and to give birth. The orcas, adult males, weighing 6 tons, 10 meters long, wait in the surf zone. When a young sea lion ventures too close to the breaking waves, an orca rides a swell up onto the beach itself, grabs the prey, and uses the next wave to slide back into the water. It is called intentional stranding. There is a specific window of about 3 weeks each year, usually March or April, when the technique is taught from mothers to calves. Researchers have watched mothers deliberately ground themselves with no prey present, encouraging young orcas to do the same. It is one of the few documented examples of cultural transmission in a non-human species. The pod is small, fewer than 30 individuals, and the technique exists only here. If this generation does not pass it on, it will be gone. Further south along the coast, hundreds of thousands of Magellanic penguins come ashore each year to breed. They dig burrows into the loose soil, lay 2 eggs, and feed their young on anchovies caught in the cold inshore waters. They walk in long, single-file processions from the surf to the colony, looking, at a distance, like commuters on a footpath. Patagonia's wildlife belongs to a wilderness that is not, strictly speaking, intact. The seas have been overfished.
The steppes have been overgrazed by sheep.
The rivers have been dammed. But the scale of the place is so large, and the human population so small, that there is still room. For whales, for condors, for the last few thousand humu deer hidden in the southern beech forests, for pumas patrolling the high country. What you see in Patagonia is in many cases the recovery of a place that the 20th century almost destroyed. In the southern Andes, where the ice field meets the granite, 3 peaks rise abruptly out of a glacial lake. They look like the teeth of a stone saw set into the sky. This is Torres del Paine. Torres is Spanish for towers. Paine is a Tehuelche word meaning approximately blue. The towers rise more than 2,000 meters above the surrounding land. They are not the tallest mountains in Patagonia. Mount San Valentin, further north, is higher. But they are the most photographed because they show in a single frame what wind and ice can do to stone. The towers are pillars of granite, exposed by 12 million years of erosion. Around them, the wind off the ice field is so strong and so constant that even in the middle of summer, it can knock a fully loaded backpacker off her feet. The trails through Torres del Paine National Park, the W Trek, the O Trek, are some of the most popular hiking routes in South America. They are also regularly closed for hours or days at a time when the wind exceeds 80 kilometers an hour. On a still day, you can stand by the Grey Glacier, one of the major glaciers feeding into the park's southern lake, and listen. The ice itself is silent, but occasionally, deep within the glacier, a fissure opens. The sound carries across the lake like distant cannon fire. Across the border in Argentina, a 4-hour drive away, sits the granite spire of Cerro Fitzroy. Fitzroy was named in 1877 after Robert Fitzroy,
The captain of the Beagle.
the same ship that gave its name to the channel further south, the same ship that carried Darwin around the southern tip of South America. It was Darwin's voyage on the Beagle that first introduced the world scientifically to Patagonia. Darwin wrote about the steppes, the guanacos, the Tehuelche he met in Tierra del Fuego. He wrote about the great fossils he found embedded in the cliffs. Many of his ideas about evolution by natural selection were first sketched here. Fitzroy itself is not a high mountain by global standards, 3,400 meters, but its profile is so sheer and the surrounding ice cap so unforgiving that it has been climbed only a few hundred times since the first ascent in 1952. The mountain creates its own weather. Storms can roll in from the Pacific in less than an hour. Climbers wait in the small town of El Chalten, population around 3,000, sometimes for weeks, for a window of clear weather long enough to attempt the summit. El Chalten did not exist until 1985. The Argentine government founded it for one specific reason: to put a permanent population at the foot of Fitzroy, in order to strengthen Argentina's claim to a contested section of the border with Chile. That, more than any other fact, captures the modern history of Patagonia. Even now, in the era of satellite borders and international tribunals, the question of whose mountain and whose glacier and whose lake is settled in the end by who lives there. To understand how dangerous that question became in 1978, you have to understand who was running both countries. In Argentina, in 1976, the military had seized power in a coup. The new government, a junta led by General Jorge Rafael Videla, was conducting what it called the process of national reorganization. In practice, this meant kidnapping, torturing, and killing tens of thousands of suspected dissidents, the so-called desaparecidos, the disappeared. Argentine human rights groups would later document around 30,000 victims. In Chile, since 1973, the military had been in power under General Augusto Pinochet, who had taken control after the violent overthrow of the elected socialist president Salvador Allende. Pinochet's government had killed thousands of its own citizens and tortured tens of thousands more. Both governments were international pariahs. Both were under arms embargoes from the United States. Both ruled by claiming repeatedly that they were the only thing standing between their nations and chaos. In 1971, before the coups, Chile and Argentina had agreed to settle the Beagle Channel question through binding international arbitration, with the British Crown overseeing the process. The case was heard by an expert panel of international jurists. They studied the 1881 treaty. They examined the maritime geography, and in May of 1977, they announced their decision. The three islands, Picton, Lennox, and Nueva, were Chilean. The maritime border swung out into the Atlantic. In January of 1978, the Argentine junta declared the ruling fundamentally null. There was no legal basis for the rejection. International arbitration is binding by definition. That is the entire point. But the Argentine generals had decided internally that they could not accept a ruling that would deny them the southern Atlantic. And perhaps more importantly, they had decided that they could win a war against Chile. On paper, it was not unreasonable. Argentina had a larger population, a larger economy, and modern equipment recently purchased from Germany and France. Chile was isolated, embargoed, surrounded, with its supply lines stretched the full length of a country 2,500 miles long. The Argentine planners assumed a quick war. What they did not adequately calculate was geography. The Andes are not just a border, they are a wall. The mountain passes that connect Argentina and Chile are narrow, high, and easily defended. Chile had spent the months since Argentina's rejection mining the passes, dynamiting roads, fortifying every choke point. The Chilean army had also designated long stretches of highway as alternative airstrips, dispersing aircraft so they could not be destroyed in a single wave of attacks. And the Chilean fleet, outnumbered on paper, had positioned itself among the islands and fjords of the Beagle Channel, where the geography itself favored the defender. A larger Argentine task force, attacking from the open sea, would have to come through narrow channels where it could not bring its size to bear. In late 1978, both navies were already at sea. Through October and November, the negotiations failed. The two foreign ministers met. Then, they did not meet. Letters were exchanged that grew steadily colder. By the beginning of December, both countries had largely accepted that war was coming. On December 12th, in a meeting in Buenos Aires, the Argentine junta finalized the operation plan. Some of the Argentine generals had already named their attack, Operativo Soberania. The objective was no longer just the 3 islands. The objective by then was the city of Santiago itself. Across the Atlantic, in Rome, a man who had been pope for less than 2 months received a telegram from his nuncio in Buenos Aires. Pope John Paul II, born Karol Wojtyła in southern Poland, elected to the papacy on October 16, 1978, read the message and understood immediately what it meant. 2 of the largest Catholic populations in the world were about to fight a war against each other. The Vatican had spent decades positioning itself as a moral, not political, authority.
But Catholic populations in Argentina and Chile
were so culturally tied to Rome that the Pope's word, on the right matter, could be more powerful than any law. On December 12th, John Paul II offered formally to mediate the dispute. Chile accepted. Argentina did not, at first. The junta sent Argentine envoys to Rome to study the offer. They did not refuse it outright, but they did not accept it either. The Pope, watching from Rome, understood that this was a delaying tactic. On December 21, 1978, intelligence reports reached the Vatican that the Argentine fleet had left port. On December 22nd, at 8 in the evening, the same 8 in the evening that opened this story, the operation began. At 2200 hours on December 22, 1978, Argentine Naval Infantry Battalions 3 and 4 were scheduled to land on Picton, Lennox, and Nueva. At midnight, the invasion of mainland Chile was scheduled to begin. At dawn the next morning, Argentine Skyhawk fighter bombers would attack Chilean airfields. By the second day, 3 full army corps would cross the Andes through the high passes. The objective, written in the operation plan in plain language, was the seizure of Santiago. The Chilean fleet was waiting in the fjords of Host Island, 60 miles west of the Beagle. Rear Admiral Raúl López, chief of the Chilean fleet, was under orders to engage if the Argentines moved. The Chilean army had over 45,000 troops on the line. Pinochet had told his commanders to expect a long war. And then, a storm arrived. The same Pacific weather system that had been visible on satellite for 2 days dropped onto the southern tip of South America with full force. The Drake Passage, the most violent stretch of ocean on Earth, even in calm conditions, became impassable. The Argentine task force, sailing south of Cape Horn, ran into seas that made amphibious landings physically impossible.
the fleet held position.
The clock ran past the scheduled landing time. The invasion was suspended for 24 hours. In Rome, that 24 hours was everything. Pope John Paul II, learning that the operation had been delayed, did not wait. He picked up the telephone himself. He called the apostolic nuncios in Buenos Aires and Santiago. He instructed them to deliver, in person, an offer that he would send Cardinal Antonio Samoré, a Vatican diplomat with decades of experience in Latin America, to both capitals as his personal envoy. Not as a mediator yet, just as a messenger. The message was simple. The Pope was watching. The world was watching. If a war began now between two Catholic nations over 3 small islands, the moral cost would fall on the men who started it. In Buenos Aires, the Argentine junta read the message. They knew what it meant. Argentina was overwhelmingly Catholic. The Pope was the most popular foreign figure in the country. A war that the Pope publicly opposed could not be sold to Argentine families as a defense of the nation. It could only be sold as defiance of God. On the morning of December 23rd, 6 hours before the rescheduled landing, the Argentine fleet received an order from Buenos Aires. Turn back. The order was not explained over the radio. The captains were simply told to reverse course and return to base. Whether the Argentine infantry on the Andean border had already crossed into Chile in the early hours of the operation, Argentine sources later insisted they had, has never been definitively established. What is established is this: the fleet turned. The aircraft did not take off. The mountains stayed quiet. On December 25th, Christmas Day, Cardinal Samoré arrived in Buenos Aires. On January 8, 1979, in a hotel in Montevideo, both governments signed an act formally requesting that the Vatican mediate the dispute and pledging not to use force against each other. The mediation took 5 years. Cardinal Samoré shuttled between Buenos Aires, Santiago, and Rome. The Pope made a formal proposal in 1980. Argentina rejected it. Then the Falklands War happened. Argentina invaded the British-held Falkland Islands in April of 1982, lost in 74 days, and the junta collapsed. A democratic government was elected in Argentina in 1983. The new president, Raúl Alfonsín, took up the Pope's proposal again. On November 25, 1984, Argentina held a non-binding national referendum on the second papal proposal. The result? 82.6% of Argentines voted to accept the deal, to give the islands to Chile, to take the maritime rights, to end the dispute. On November 29, 1984, in Vatican City, the foreign ministers of Argentina and Chile signed the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. The treaty held. It still holds more than 40 years later. Argentina recognizes Picton, Lennox, and Nueva as Chilean. The maritime border is settled. There has been no military mobilization on the southern frontier since. The mountain pass through which Cardinal Samoré crossed and recrossed during his shuttle diplomacy, a pass in the southern Andes between Argentina and Chile, was renamed in his honor. It is now called Paso Cardinal Antonio Samoré. Buses crossing it in either direction stop for passport control on a road named after a man who, by walking back and forth between two governments for 5 years, prevented a war. No one will ever know exactly what would have happened if the storm had not delayed the operation by 24 hours, or if the Pope had not picked up the phone. The Argentine plan called for seizing the islands within hours. The Chilean plan called for fighting in the mountains for as long as it took. Neither side believed the war would be short. American intelligence assessments, recently declassified, estimate that the conflict could have killed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians on both sides, and that, at minimum, Brazil and Bolivia and Peru would have been pulled into it. But it didn't happen. 6 hours from beginning, the order was reversed. 24 hours later, an envoy from the Vatican was on a plane to Buenos Aires. 40 days later, both countries had signed away their right to fight. In the end, the only thing that prevented the war that should have started in December of 1978 was a confluence of two things that, on paper, no defense planner would ever rely on: a storm in the Drake Passage, and a Polish priest who had been Pope for 68 days. Today, you can stand on the shore at Ushuaia, at the southern edge of Tierra del Fuego, and look across the Beagle Channel toward the Chilean side. The water is 2 miles wide here. On a clear day, you can see Puerto Williams, the small Chilean naval base on the far shore, population around 2,500, that competes with Ushuaia for the title of southernmost city in the world. The two cities have working ferry service between them. The crossing takes about 30 minutes. The border guards on both sides are bored. But the cross-border traffic is small. Trade between Argentine Patagonia and Chilean Patagonia, even now, is almost insignificant. The two halves of the same geography mostly ignore each other. Patagonians on the Chilean side fly through Santiago to reach Buenos Aires. Patagonians on the Argentine side rarely visit Chile at all. The treaty held, but the integration that was supposed to follow it never quite arrived. The Mapuche, who never agreed to either border, continue to challenge both governments over land rights, mining permits, and the legal recognition of their communities. They are still here, so by their own account, are descendants of the Tehuelche, and even of the Selknam, challenging the official pronouncement that their peoples are extinct. At the Cave of Hands, the painted left hands on the rock walls are 9,000 years older than any treaty. They will outlast the next one too. Patagonia is sometimes described in travel writing as the end of the world. The phrase comes from the geography. Beyond the southern tip, there is only ocean and Antarctica. But it suggests something else as well. A place where time has stopped. A place beyond politics. It is neither. Patagonia is one of the most argued over pieces of land in the southern hemisphere. Two countries spent 2 centuries trying to divide it, exterminated its first peoples to make room for the borders, brought in foreign settlers as living markers of national claim, and as recently as 40 years ago, came within 6 hours of fighting a war for it. The beauty exists not because Patagonia was untouched, it exists despite everything that has been done here. What survives? The glaciers, the condors, the painted hands, the Welsh chapels, the right whales returning to Peninsula Valdez, the guanacos moving in single file through the steppe at the same pace they kept 10,000 years ago, survives in spite of the political weight of the place, not in ignorance of it. The wind still blows here, as it always has, off the Pacific and over the Andes and out across the steppe to the Atlantic. The condors still cross the border without papers. The ice still carves into the lakes. And somewhere, in a cave outside Puerto Natales, the dried skin of a creature that died at the end of the last ice age is still waiting on a shelf, 12,000 years older than the line on the map. Thank you for traveling with us to the bottom of the world. We'll see you on the next journey.